The next up is Sonnet 10.
Daughter to that good Earl, once President of England's Council and her Treasury, who lived in both unstained with gold or fee, and left them both more in himself content, till the sad breaking of that Parliament broke him as that dishonest victory at Caranea, fatal to liberty, killed with report that old man eloquent, though later born than to have known the days wherein your father flourished, yet by you, madam, methinks I see him living yet. So well your words his noble virtues praise, that all both judge you to relate them true, and to possess them, honoured Margaret.
Next up, Sonnet 11.
And book was writ of late called Tetrachordon, and woven close both matter, form, and style. The subject knew, it walked the town a while, numbering good intellects now seldom poured on. Cries the stall reader, bless us, what a word on! A title page is this, and some in file stand spelling foals, while one might walk to the Mile End Green. Why is it harder, sirs, than Gordon, Colkitto, or Macdonald, or Gillespie? Those rugged names to our like mouths grow sleek, that would have made Quilitian stare and gasp. Thy age, like ours, O soul of Sir John Cheek, hated not learning was then toad or asp, when thou thought'st Cambridge and Edward Greek.
Sonnet 12. On the same. I did but prompt the age to quit their clogs by the known rules of ancient liberty, when straight a barbarous noise environs me of owls and cuckoos, asses, apes, and dogs. As when those hinds that were transformed to frogs railed at Latona's twin-born progeny, which after held the sun and moon in fee, but this is got by casting pearl to hogs. That bawl for freedom in their senseless mood, and still revolt when truth would set them free. License, they mean, when they cry liberty. For who loves that must first be wise and good, but from that, mark how far they rove we see, for all this waste of wealth and loss of blood.
Sonnet 13. Harry, whose tuneful and well-measured song first taught our English music how to smell. Words with just notes and accents, not to scan, with the Midas ears, committing short and long. Thy worth and skill exempts thee from the throng, with praise enough for enemy to look on. To after age thou shalt be the man, that with smooth air couldst humour best our tongue. Thou honourest verse, and verse must lend her wing to honour thee, the priest of Phoebus' choir, that tunes the happiest signs in hymn or story. Dante shall give fame leave to set thee higher than his castella, whom he who would to sing met in the milder shades of purgatory.
For his friend, Mrs. Catherine Thomason, following her death, John Milton, Sonnet 14. When faith and love, which parted from thee never, had ripened thy just soul to dwell with God, meekly thou didst resign this earthly load of death called life, which us from life doth sever. Thy works and alms, all thy good endeavour, stayed not behind, nor in the grave were trod, but as faith pointed with her golden rod, followed thee up to joy and bliss forever. Love led them on, and faith, who knew them best, thy handmaids, clad them all with purple beams and azure wings, that up they flew, so dressed. and speak the truth of thee on glorious themes before the judge, who thenceforth bid thee rest and drink thy fill of pure immortal streams.
Next up is excerpts from Tenure of Kings and Magistrates.
If men within themselves would be governed by reason, and generally not give up their understanding to a double tyranny of custom from without and blind affections within, they would discern better what it is to favour and uphold the tyrant of a nation. But being slaves within doors, no wonder that they strive so much to have the public state comfortably governed to the inward virtuous rule by which they govern themselves. For indeed, none can love freedom heartily but good men. The rest love not freedom, but license, which never hath more scope or more indulgence than under tyrants. Hence is it that tyrants are not oft offended, nor stand much in doubt of bad men, as being all naturally servile, but in whom virtue and true worth most is eminent, then they fear in suspicion. In earnest as by right their master, against them lies all their hatred and suspicion. Consequential, neither do bad men hate tyrants, but have always readiness with their falsified names of loyalty and obedience to colour over their base compliances. And although sometimes for shame, when it comes to their own grievances, of purse especially, they would seem good patriots and side with the better cause, yet when others, for the deliverance of their country, endued with fortitude, and heroic virtue, to fear nothing but the curse written against those that do the work of the Lord negligently, would go on to remove not only the calamities and doldrums of a people, but the roots and causes whence they spring. Straight these men, and sure helpers at need, as if they hated only the miseries, not the mischiefs, after they had juggled and paltered with the word, bandied and borne armies against their king, divested him, disanointed him, nay, cursed him all over in their pulpits and their pamphlets, to the imagining of sincere and real men, beyond what is possible or honest to retreat from, not only turn revolters from those principles, which only could at first move them, but lay the stain of disloyalty and worse on those proceedings, whence they are necessarily consequence of their own former actions, nor disliked by themselves, where they manage to the entire advantage of their own faction. Not considering the while that he toward whom they boasted their new fidelity counted them accessory, and by those statutes and laws which they so importantly bandish against others, would have doomed them to a traitor's death for what they have done already. And for a flash, hot and active, but through sloth and insolence and weakness of spirit, either fainting ere their own pretences, they never so just be half attained, or through an inbred falsehood and wickedness, betray oft times to destruction with themselves, men of noblest temper, joined with them for causes whereof they in their rash understandings were not capable.
If God and a good cause give them victory, the prosecution whereof, for the most part, inevitably draws after it the alteration of laws, change of government, downfall of princes with their families, then comes the task to those worthies which are the soul of that enterprise, to be swelt and laboured out amidst the throng and noises of vulgar and irrational men. Some contesting for privileges, customs, forms, and that old entanglement of iniquity, their gibberish laws, though the badge of their ancient slavery. Others who have been fiercest against their prince under the notion of a tyrant, and no mean incendiaries of the war against him, when God, out of his providence and high disposal, hath allowed him into the hand of their brethren, on a sudden and in a new garb of allegiance, which their doings have long since cancelled, they plead for him, pity him, extol him, protest against those that talk of bringing him to the trial of justice, which is the sword of God, superior to all mortal things, in whose hands soever by apparent signs his testified will is to put it. But certainly, if we consider who and what they are, on a sudden grown so pitiful, we may conclude their pity can be no true and Christian commiseration, but either levity and shallowness of mind, or else a carnal admiring of that worldly pomp and greatness from whence they see him fallen. Or rather, lastly, a dissembled and seditious pity, feigned of industry to beget new discord. As for mercy, if it be to a tyrant, under which name they themselves have cited him so oft in the hearing of God, of angels, and the Holy Church assembled, and there charged him with the spilling of more innocent blood by far than ever Nero did, undoubtedly the mercy which they pretend is the mercy of wicked men, and their mercies, we read, are cruelties, hazarding the welfare of a whole nation to have saved one, whom so oft they have termed Agag, and vilifying the blood of many Jonathans that have saved Israel, insisting with much niceness on the unnecessariest clause of their covenant rested, wherein the fear of change and the absurd contradiction of a flattering hostility had hampered them, but not scrupling to give way for compliments to an implacable revenge the heads of many thousand Christians more.
Who coming in the course of these affairs to have their share in great actions, above the form of law or custom, at least to give their voice an approbation, begin to swerve and almost shiver at the majesty and grandeur of some noble deed, as if they were newly entered into a great sin, disputing precedents, forms, and circumstances, when the commonwealth nigh perishes for want of deeds in substance, done with just and faithful expedition. To these I wish better instruction, and virtue equal to their calling, the former of which, that is to say, instruction, I shall endeavour, as my duty is to bestow on them, and exhort them not to start from just and pious resolution of adhering with all their strength and assistance to present Parliament and army in their glorious way, wherein justice and victory hath set them. The only warrants through all ages, next under immediate revelation, to exercise supreme power in these proceedings, which hereto appear equal to what hath been in any nation where heretofore justly or magnanimously. Nor let them be discouraged or deterred by any new apostate sacros, who under show of giving counsel send out their barking monasteries and mementos, empty of aught else but the spleen of frustrated faction. How can that pretended counsel be sound or faithful, when they give it, see not madness or vexation for their ends lost? That those statutes and scriptures, which both falsely and scandalously they rest against their friends and associates, would by sentence of common adversary fall first and heaviest on their own heads. Neither let mild and tender dispositions be foolishly softened from their duty and perseverance with the masculine rhetoric of any pulling priest and chaplain, sent as friendly letter of advice, for fashion's sake in private, and forthwith publish by the sender himself, that we may know much of a friend there was in it, to cast odious envy upon them, to whom they pretended to be sent in charity. Nor let any man be deluded by either ignorance or notorious hypocrisy and self-repugnance of our dancing divines, who have the conscience and boldness to come with scriptures in their mouths, glossed and fitted for their tunes of double contradictory sense, transforming the sacred verity of God, an idol with two faces, looking once 2 ways, with the same quotations to charge others, which in the same case they made to serve to justify themselves. For while the hope may be classic and providential lords led them on, while pluralities greased thick and deep, to the shame and scandal of religion, more than all the sects and heresies they exclaim against, then to fight against king's person, and no less a party of the Lords and his commons. And to put force upon these houses was such good, was lawful, not resisting of superior powers, they only with powers not resisted, who countenanced the good and punished the evil. Now their censorious domineerings is not suffered to be universal, and truth and conscience is to be freed, titles and pluralities to be no more, though competence, allowance provided, and the warm experience of large gifts, so they so good at taking them, and yet now exclude and seize upon impeached members, to bring delinquents without exemption a fair tribunal by common national law against murder, is now no less than Korah, Dathan, or Abram. He who would erstwhile in the pulpits be cursed tyrant, an enemy to God and saints, laden with all the innocent blood spilt in these three kingdoms, and so fought against as now, but nothing penitent or altered from his first principles, a law magistrate, a sovereign lord, the Lord's anointed, not to be touched, though by themselves imprisoned. As this only were obedience to preserve the mere useless bulk of this person, and the only in prison, not in the field, but to disobey his commands, deny him his dignity and office, everywhere to resist his power, but where they think it only serving their own faction.
But who in particular is a tyrant cannot be determined in a general discourse, otherwise than by supposition. His particular charge and the sufficient proof of it must determine that, which I leave to magistrates, at least to the uprighter sort of them, and of the people, though in number less by many, in whom faction least hath prevailed above the law of nature and right reason, to judge as they find cause. But this I dare own as part of my faith, that if such a one there be, by whose commission, whose massacres have been committed on his faithful subjects, his provinces offered to pawn or destroy or alienation, as the hire of those whom he had solicited to come in and destroy whole cities and countries, be he king or tyrant or emperor, the sword of justice is above him, in whose hands soever is found sufficient power to avenge the effusion and so great a deluge of innocent blood. For if all human power to execute, not accidentally, but intendedly, the wrath of God upon evildoers without exception be of God, then that power, whether ordinary, or if that fail, extraordinary, so executing that intent of God is lawful and not to be resisted. But to unfold more at large this whole question, though with all expedient brevity, I shall here set down from the first beginning, the original of kings, how and wherefore exalted to that dignity above their brethren, and from thence shall prove that turning to tyranny, they may be as lawfully deposed and punished as they were at first elected. This I shall do by authorities and reasons not learnt in corners among schisms and heresies, as our doubling divines are ready to calumniate, but fetched out of the midst of choicest and most authentic learning, and no prohibited authors, nor many heathen, but mosaical, Christian, orthodoxal, and, which must needs be more convincing to our adversaries, presbyterial.
No man who knows aught can be so stupid to deny that all men naturally were born free, being the image and resemblance of God himself, and were by privilege above all the creatures, born to command and not to obey, and that they lived so. Till from the root of Adam's transgression, falling among themselves to do wrong and violence, and foreseeing that such courses must needs tend to destruction of them all, They agreed by common league to bind each other from mutual injury, and jointly to defend themselves against any that gave disturbance or opposition to such agreement. Hence came cities, towns, and commonwealths. And because no faith in all was found sufficiently binding, they saw it needful to ordain some authority that might restrain by force and punishment what was violated against peace and common right. This authority and power of self-defense and preservation being originally and naturally every one of them, and united in them all, for ease, for order, and least each man should be his own partial judge. They communicated and derived either to one, whom for the eminence of his wisdom and integrity they chose above the rest, or to more than one whom they thought of equal deserving. The first was called a king, the other magistrates, not to be their lords and maesters, though afterwards those names in some places were given voluntarily to such as had been authors of inestimable good to the people, but to be their deputies and commissioners, to execute by virtue of their entrusted power that justice which else every man by the bond of nature and of covenant must have executed for himself and for one another. And to him that shall consider well why among free persons one man by civil right should bear authority and jurisdiction over another, no other end or reason can be imaginable. These for a while governed well, and with much equity decided all things at their own arbitrament, till the temptation of such a power left absolute in their hands perverted them at length to injustice and partiality. Then did they who now by trial had found the danger and inconveniences of committing arbitrary power to any, invent laws either framed or consented to by all, that should confine and limit the authority of whom they chose to govern them, that so man, of whose failing they had proof, might no more rule over them, but law and reason abstracted as much as might be from personal errors and frailties. While as the magistrate was set above the people, so the law was set above the magistrate. When this would not serve, but that the law was either not executed or misapplied, they were constrained from that time, the only remedy left them, to put conditions and take oaths from all kings and magistrates at their first installment to do impartial justice by law, who upon those terms and no other received allegiance from the people. That is to say, bond or covenant to obey them in execution of those laws which they the people had themselves made or assented to. And this oft times with express warning that if the king or magistrate proved unfaithful to his trust, the people would be disengaged. They added also councillors and parliaments, not to be only at his beck, but with him or without him, at set times or at all times, when any danger threatened to have care of the public safety. Therefore saith Claudius Cecil, a French statesman, the parliament was set as a bridle to the king, which I instance rather, not because our English lawyers have not said the same long before, but because that French monarchy is granted by all to be a far more absolute than ours, that this and the rest of what hath hitherto been spoken is most true, might be capaciously made appear throughout all stories, heathen and Christian, even of those nations where kings and emperors have sought means to abolish all ancient memory of the people's right by their encroachments and usurpations. But I spare long insertions, appealing to the known constitutions of both the latest Christian empires in Europe, the Greek and German, besides the French, Italian, Aragonian, English, and not least the Scottish histories. Not forgetting this only, by the way, that William the Norman, though a conqueror and not unsworn at his coronation, was compelled the second time to take oath at St. Albans, ere the people would be brought to yield obedience.
It being thus manifest that the power of kings and magistrates is nothing else but what is only derivative, transferred and committed to them in trust from the people to the common good of them all, in whom the power yet remains fundamentally and cannot be taken from them without a violation of their natural birthright. And seeing that from hence Aristotle and the best of political writers have defined a king, him who governs to the good and profit of his people, and not for his own ends, it follows from necessary causes that the titles of sovereign lord, natural lord, and the like are either arrogancies or flatteries not admitted by emperors and kings of best note, and disliked by the church, both of Jews and ancient Christians, as appears by Tertullian and others.
Secondly, that to say, as is usual, the king hath as good right to his crown and dignity as any man to his inheritance, is to make the subject no better than the king's slave, his chattel, or his possession that may be bought and sold. And doubtless, if hereditary title were sufficiently inquired, the best foundation of it would be found either but in courtesy or convenience. But so suppose it to be of right hereditary, which what can be more just and legal, if a subject for certain comes be to forfeit by law from himself, and posterity all his heritance to the king, then that a king, for crimes proportional, should forfeit all his title and inheritance to the people, unless the people must be thought created all for him, he not for them, and they all in one body inferior to him single, which were a kind of treason against the dignity of mankind to affirm.
Thirdly, it follows that by say kings are accountable to none but God, is overturning all the law and government. For if they may refuse to give account, then all covenants made with them at coronation, all oaths are in vain, and a mere mockeries, all laws which they swear to keep made of no purpose. For if the king fear not God, as how many of them do not, we hold then our lives and estates by the tenure of his mere grace and mercy, as from God, not mortal magistrate, a position that none but court parasites or men besotted would maintain. Aristotle, therefore, whom we commonly allow for one of the best interpreters of nature and morality, writes in his fourth Policies that monarchy unaccountable is the worst sort of tyranny, and at least all to be endured by free men. And surely no Christian prince, not drunk with high mind, and prouder than those pagan Caesars that defied themselves, would arrogant and so unreasonably above human condition, or derogate so basely from the whole nation of men his brethren, as if he were only subsisting and to serve his glory, valuing them in comparison with his own brute will and pleasure, no more than so many beasts or vermin under his feet, not so reasoned with, but to be trod on. Amongst those who might be found so many thousand men for wisdom, virtue, noblest of mind, and all other respects, but the fortune of his dignity far above him. Yet some would persuade us that his absurd opinion was David's, because the 51st Psalm he cries out to God, "Against thee only have I sinned," as if David had imagined that to murder Uriah and adulterate his wife had been no sin against his neighbor, whenas the law of Moses was to the king expressly not to think so highly of himself above his brethren. David, therefore, by these words could mean no other than either the depth of his guiltiness was known to God only, or so few as he would not the will or power to question them, or that sin against God was greater beyond compare than against Uriah. Whatever his meaning were, any wise man would see the patriarchal words of the psalm can no uncertain decision to a point have been abundantly more certain rules gone by. But how much rationally spake the heathen king Depheron in the tragedies of Euripides, when these interpreters would put upon the king, I rule not my people by tyranny as if they were barbarians, but I am self-liable. I do unjustly to suffer justly. Not unlike with the speech of Trajan, the worthy emperor, to one whom he made general of his praetorian forces. Take this drawn sword, he said, use it for me, if I reign well, if not, use it against me. Thus Dion relates, and not Trajan only, but Theodosius the younger and the Christian emperor of one the best, caused it to be enacted, and a rule undeniable and fit to be acknowledged by all kings and emperors, that a prince is bound by the laws, and that on the authority of the law and of the authority of prince depends, and upon the laws ought submit. Which edict of his remains yet in the code of Justinian as a sacred constitution to all succeeding emperors. How then can any king in Europe maintain and write himself accountable to none but God, when emperors in their own imperial statutes have written and decreed themselves accountable to law? And indeed, where such account is not feared, he that bids a man reign over him above law may well as bid a savage beast.
We may from hence, with more ease and force of argument, determine what a tyrant is, and what the people may do against him. A tyrant, whether by wrong or by right, coming to the crown, is he who, regarding neither law nor the common good, reigns only for himself and his faction. Thus St. Basil, among others, defines him, and because his power is great, his will boundless and exorbitant, the fulfilling whereof is for the most part accompanied with innumerable wrongs and oppressions of the people, murders, massacres, rapes, adulteries, desolation, and subversion of cities and whole provinces. Look how great a good and happiness a just king is, so great a mischief is a tyrant. As he the public father of his country, so this the common enemy, against whom what the people lawfully may do, as against a common pest and destroyer of mankind. I suppose no man of clear judgment need go further to be guided then by the very principles of nature in him. But because it is the vulgar folly of men to desert their own reason, and shutting the eyes to think they see best with other men's, I shall show by such examples as ought to have most weight with us, what hath been done in this case heretofore. The Greeks and Romans, as their prime authors witness, held it not only lawful, but a glorious and heroic deed, rewarded publicly with statues and garlands, to kill an infamous tyrant at any time without trial, but with reason, that he who trod down all law should not be vouchsafed the benefit of law. Insomuch that Seneca, the tragedian, brings in Hercules, the grand suppressor of tyrants, thus speaking, there can be slain no sacrifice to God more acceptable than an unjust and wicked king.
It is also affirmed from diligent search made in our ancient books of law that the peers and barons of England had a legal right to judge the king, which was the cause most likely, for it could be no slight cause, that they were called his peers or equals. This, however, may stand immovable, so long as man hath to deal with no better than man, that if our law judge all men to the lowest by their peers, it should be in all equity ascend also, and judge the highest. And so much I find both in our own and foreign story, that dukes, earls, and marquises were at first not hereditary, not empty and vain titles, but names of trust and office, and with the office ceasing, as induces me to be of opinion, that every worthy man in Parliament, for the word baron imports no more, might for the public good be thought a fit peer and judge of the king. Without regard had to petty caveats and circumstances, the chief impediment in high affairs, and ever stood upon most by circumstantial men. Whence doubtless our ancestors, who were not ignorant with what rights either nature or ancient constitution had endowed them, when oaths both at coronation and renewed in parliament would not serve, thought it no way illegal to depose and put to death their tyrannous kings, insomuch that the parliament drew up a charge against Richard II, and the commons requested to have judgment decreed against him, that the realm might not be endangered.
But far before these days, Gildas, the most ancient of all our historians, speaking of those times wherein the Roman Empire decaying, quitted and relinquished what right they had by conquest to this island, and resigned it all into the people's hands, testifies that the people thus reinvested with their own original right about the year 446, both elected them kings, whom they thought best. The first Christian British kings that ever reigned here since the Romans, and by the same right, when they apprehended cause, usually deposed and put them to death. This is the most fundamental and ancient tenure that any king of England can produce or pretend to, in comparison of which all other titles and pleas are but of yesterday. If any object that Gildas condemns, if any object that Gildas condemns the Britons for so doing, the answer is as ready, that he condemns them no more for so doing than he did before for choosing such. For, saith he, they anointed them kings not of God, but such as were more bloody than the rest. Next, he condemns them not at all for deposing or putting them to death, but for doing it over hastily, without trial or well examining the cause, and for electing others worse in their room. Thus we have here both domestic and most ancient examples that the people of Britain have deposed and put to death their kings in those primitive Christian times.
Precedent from any Protestant state or kingdom, the examples which follow shall be all Protestant and chiefly Presbyterian. In the year 1546, the Duke of Saxony, Landgrave of Hessen, and the whole Protestant League raised open war against Charles V, their emperor, sent him a defiance, renounced all faith and allegiance towards him, and debated long in council whether they should give him so much as the title of Caesar.
In the year 1559, the Scots Protestants, claiming purpose of their Queen Regent for liberty of conscience, she, answering that promises were not to be claimed of princes beyond what was commodious for them to grant, told her to her face in Parliament, then at Stirling, that it was so, and they renounced their obedience.
In the year 1564, John Knox, the most famous divine and the reformer of Scotland to the Presbyterian discipline, at a General Assembly, maintained openly in a dispute against Lethington, the Secretary of State, that subjects might and ought execute God's judgment upon their king. But the fact of Jehu and others against their king having the ground of God's ordinary command to put such and such offenders to death was not extraordinary, but to be imitated of all that preferred the honour of God to the affection of flesh and wicked princes, that kings, if they offend, have no privilege to be exempted from the punishments of law more than any other subject. So that if the king be a murderer, adulterer, or idolater, he should suffer not as a king, but as an offender. And this position he repeats again and again before them.
And after that, the Scots, in justification of their deposing Queen Mary, sent ambassadors to Queen Elizabeth, and in a written declaration alleged that they had used toward her more lenity than she deserved, and that their ancestors had hitherto punished their kings by death or banishment, that the Scots were a free nation, made king whom they freely chose, and with the same freedom unkinged him, if they saw cause, by right of ancient laws and ceremonies yet remaining, and old customs yet among the Highlanders in choosing the head of their clans or families, all which with many other arguments bore witness that regal power was nothing else but a mutual covenant or stipulation between king and people. In the year 1581, the states of Holland in a general assembly at The Hague abjured all obedience and subjection to Philip, King of Spain, and in a declaration justified their so doing, for that by his tyrannous governance against faith so many times given and broken, he had lost his rights to all the Belgic provinces, that therefore they deposed him and declared it lawful to choose another in his stead. From that time to this, no state or kingdom in the world hath equally prospered, but let them remember not to look with an evil and prejudicial eye upon their neighbors walking by the same rule.
There is nothing that so actually makes a king of England as rightful possession and supremacy in all causes, both civil and ecclesiastical. And nothing that so actually makes a subject of England as those 2 oaths of allegiance and supremacy observed without equivocating or any mental reservation. Out of doubt, then, when the king shall command things already constituted in church or state, obedience is the true essence of a subject, either to do if it be lawful, or if he hold the thing unlawful, to submit to that penalty which the law imposes, so long as he intends to remain a subject. Therefore, when the people or any part of them shall rise against the king and his authority, executing the law in anything established, civil or ecclesiastical, I do not say it is rebellion if the thing commanded, though established, be unlawful, and that they sought first all due means of redress, and no man is further bound to law. But I say it is an absolute renouncing both of supremacy and allegiance, which in one word is an actual and total deposing of the king, and the setting up of another supreme authority over them.
And surely they that shall boast, as we do, to be a free nation, and not have in themselves the power to remove or to abolish any governor supreme or subordinate, with the government itself upon urgent causes, may please their fancy with a ridiculous and painted freedom fit to cozen babies, but are indeed under tyranny and servitude, as wanting that power which is the root and source of all liberty, to dispose and economize in the land which God hath given them, as masters of family in their own house and free inheritance. Without which natural and essential power of a free nation, though bearing high their heads, they can in due esteem be thought no better than slaves and vassals born in the tenure and occupation of another inheriting lord, whose government, though not illegal or intolerable, hangs over them as a lordly scourge, not as a free government, and therefore to be abrogated. How much more justly, then, may they fling off tyranny or tyrants, who, being once deposed, can be no more than the private men, as subject to the reach of justice and arraignment as any other transgressor.
Though perhaps not till now, no Protestant state or kingdom can be alleged to have openly put to death their king, which lately some have written and imputed to their great glory, much misstating the matter. It is not, neither ought to be the glory of the Protestant state never to have put their king to death. It is the glory of the Protestant king never to have deserved death. And if the Parliament and military council do what they do without precedent, if it appear their duty, it argues the more wisdom, virtue, and magnanimity that they know themselves to be able to be set a precedent to others, who perhaps in future ages, if they prove not degenerate, will look up with honor and inspire these exemplary and matchless deeds of their ancestors as to the highest top of their civil glory and emulation, which heretofore in the pursuance of fame and foreign domain, spent it vaingloriously abroad, but henceforth may learn a better fortitude, to dare execute highest justice on them that shall by force of arms endeavour the impressing and bereaving of religion and their liberty at home. That no unbridled potentate or tyrant, but to his sorrow for the future, may presume such high and irresponsible license over mankind, to havoc and turn upside down whole kingdoms of men, as though they were no more in respect of his persevere than will a nation of pismires.
And if by reason the unjust authority of kings may be forfeited in part, and by his power be resumed in part, either by the parliament or people, for the case in hazard and the present necessity, as they affirm, there can be no scripture be alleged, no imaginable reason given, that necessity continuing, as it may always, and they in all prudence and their duty may take upon themselves to foresee it, why in such a case they may not fiercely immerse him with the loss of his kingdom, of whose amendment they have no hope. And if the parliament, being undisposable but by themselves, as is affirmed, might for his whole life, if they saw cause, take all power, authority, and the sword out of his hand, which in effect is to unmagistrate him, why might they not, being then themselves the sole magistrates in force, proceed to punish him, who being lawfully deprived of all things that define a majesty, can now be no magistrate, to be degraded lower, but an offender, to be punished. Lastly, whom they may defy and meet in battle, why may they not as well prosecute by justice? For lawful war is but the execution of justice against them who refuse law, among whom, if it be lawful to slay the king himself, coming in front at his own peril, wherefore may not justice do that intendedly, which the chance of a defensive war might without blame have done casually, nay, purposely, if there it find him among the rest? They ask, by what rule of conscience of God a state is bound to sacrifice religion, laws, and liberties, rather than a prince defending such as subvert them, should corn in hazard of his life? And I ask, by what conscience or divinity or law or reason a state is bound to leave all these sacred concernments under a perpetual hazard and extremity of danger, rather than cut off a wicked prince who sits plotting day and night to subvert them? Then tell us that the law of nature justifies any man to defend himself, even against the king in person. Let them show us then why the same law may not justify much more than a state or whole people to do justice upon him, against whom each private man may lawfully defend himself. Seeing all kind of justice done is a defense to good men, as well as a punishment to bad. But justice done upon a tyrant is no more but the necessity self-defense of a whole commonwealth.